The Japanese pilots never saw him coming. On the morning of the 27th of December, 1942, high above the jungle coastline of New Guinea, a 22-year-old American pilot pushed his aircraft into a dive that seemed almost impossible. Below him was exactly the kind of fight he had been warned about. Japanese fighters, experienced pilots, the aircraft that had ruled the Pacific sky for more than a year. The Mitsubishi 04 months. American pilots had learned one painful lesson. Do not fight the Zero the way it wants to fight, because if you did, you usually died. But Richard Bong was not turning with them. He was not trying to prove that an American fighter could outmaneuver the most agile aircraft in the world. He was doing something different. He was falling out of the sky. The twin-tailed fighter beneath him screamed through the air, engines roaring, guns lining up on a Japanese aircraft below. The Zero pilot had only seconds to react. By the time he understood what was happening, Bong was already gone. The American fighter flashed through the formation, fired, and pulled back toward the clouds before the enemy could respond. Minutes later, two Japanese aircraft were falling toward the ocean. A fighter, a bomber, Richard Bong, had scored his first victories. He did not know it yet. But that morning was the beginning of a career that would make him the highest-scoring American combat pilot in history. But the story was never only about Bong. It was about a much larger change. A moment when America stopped trying to defeat Japan's greatest weapon by copying it, and instead changed the rules of the fight completely. Because the Zero was not just an airplane. For 13 months, it represented Japanese dominance across the Pacific. When Japan attacked Pearl Harbor in December 1941, its naval aviation force possessed something the Allies struggled to understand: a fighter that seemed almost impossible to defeat. The Zero could turn tighter than anything American pilots had ever faced. It could climb quickly. It could stay in the air at incredibly slow speeds. And it was flown by men who had already gained years of combat experience fighting over China. These were not inexperienced pilots. Many had spent years mastering their aircraft before the war expanded across the Pacific. They knew exactly what their machine could do. And more importantly, they knew what enemy aircraft could not do. In the opening months of the war, that knowledge created confidence. Japanese fighters protected the attack on Pearl Harbor. They destroyed Allied aircraft in the Philippines. They helped sweep through Southeast Asia, from island to island. The Zero became a weapon of psychological warfare. American pilots began entering combat already carrying doubt. That was the most dangerous advantage an enemy could have, because before bullets were fired, the battle had already entered the pilot's mind. The question was no longer, can I win? The question became, how long can I survive? American pilots had tried fighting the Zero the traditional way. They turned. They maneuvered. They attempted to outfly the enemy in close combat. And the result was predictable. The Zero slipped behind them. The Japanese pilot waited for the perfect angle. Then, the American aircraft disappeared. The problem was not courage. American pilots were brave. The problem was that bravery could not overcome physics. A courageous pilot flying the wrong aircraft with the wrong tactics was still trapped in an unwinnable fight. The Americans needed something different, not a better version of the same battle, a completely different battle. The answer came from understanding the Zero's greatest strength. Because every strength has a weakness. The Zero could turn better than almost anything in the sky. But to achieve that agility, Japanese designers had made a difficult choice. They removed weight. The aircraft was extremely light. That gave it incredible maneuverability. But it also meant sacrificing less protection for fuel tanks. A structure that could not tolerate extreme punishment. The Zero was a brilliant duelist, fast, graceful, deadly. But only when the fight happened on its terms. The Americans had to force it into a different fight. The first major clue came from an unexpected place. In the summer of 1942, A Japanese Zero crashed in the Aleutian Islands. The pilot was killed, but the aircraft survived. American engineers recovered it. For the first time, they could study the enemy's most famous fighter directly. And what they discovered changed everything. The Zero was not invincible, it was simply specialized. At low speeds, in a turning fight, it was terrifying. But at high speeds, its controls became heavy. It struggled to maneuver. It could not safely follow an opponent through a steep dive. The weakness was clear. The Americans did not need to turn harder. They needed to stop turning. The answer was altitude, speed, energy. The fight had to move vertically. A pilot who stayed above the enemy controlled the moment of attack. He decided when the fight began. He decided when it ended. The Zero pilot was no longer hunting, he was reacting. And reaction was already too late. This idea had been developing before the P-38 Lightning arrived. In China, American volunteers under Claire Chennault had already learned that the Zero should not be fought in a traditional dogfight. They attacked from above. They made one pass, they fired. Then they escaped. The Navy discovered a similar truth through defensive formations. A slower aircraft could survive against a better turning fighter if it never fought alone and never gave the enemy the advantage of a close-range turning battle. The lesson was becoming impossible to ignore. The Zero could not be defeated by becoming another Zero, had to be defeated by becoming something else. And that something else was the Lockheed P-38 Lightning. When it first appeared, many people did not understand what they were looking at. It did not resemble the classic image of a fighter. It had two engines, two long-tail booms, a central cockpit suspended between them. It looked unusual because it was designed for an unusual war. The man behind it was engineer Clarence Kelly Johnson. His idea was simple but radical. Build a fighter that could fight at extreme altitude, travel enormous distances, and carry enough power to dominate the air. The P-38 was not built to chase the Zero around a circle. It was built to make that circle impossible. Its two engines gave it speed and reliability over the enormous distances of the Pacific that mattered. A single-engine fighter might have little chance after suffering mechanical failure far from land. A Lightning pilot could lose an engine and still have a chance to return. That possibility saved lives. The aircraft also carried something the Zero could not match: firepower. In the nose of the P-38 sat a concentrated group of weapons: a 20mm cannon, 4.50 caliber machine guns. Instead of firing from the wings, where weapons had to converge at a specific distance, the Lightning fired straight ahead. The pilot did not need perfect timing. The entire aircraft became a weapon pointed directly at the enemy. And then there was the advantage that changed everything. The Lightning could climb, it could dive, it could strike, then it could disappear before the enemy could respond. The Zero was built around the idea of controlling a close fight. The P-38 was built around refusing to give the enemy one. The new American doctrine became almost simple enough to sound impossible. Climb above the enemy. Dive, fire, break away. Climb again, never turn. Never chase. Never surrender the advantage. The hardest part was not learning the tactic. It was controlling instinct. Every fighter pilot wanted to finish the fight. After damaging an enemy aircraft, the natural reaction was to follow, to stay, to turn, to get the final shot. But against the Zero, that instinct could kill you. The pilot who chased became the pilot being hunted. The Lightning demanded discipline. It demanded patience. It demanded that pilots trust the machine and trust the method. The Japanese had built the greatest close-range fighter in the world. The Americans built a fighter that refused to enter close-range combat. And slowly, the balance began to change. But a machine alone could not win a war. The P-38 needed men willing to understand it, men willing to trust a new way of fighting. One of those men was a quiet farm boy from Wisconsin. His name was Richard Bong. Before the medals, before the victories, before newspapers called him America's greatest ace, he was simply a young pilot who loved flying. He grew up in Poplar, Wisconsin, one of 9 children in a family built around hard work. His father was a Swedish immigrant who believed discipline mattered more than attention. Richard was not the kind of person who looked destined for fame. On the ground, he was quiet, almost shy. But in the air, something changed. He had natural ability, the kind that instructors noticed immediately. He understood aircraft instinctively. He knew how they moved, how they responded, how far they could be pushed. But that talent came with a problem. Confidence became recklessness. While training in California, Bong performed unauthorized stunts, including flying dangerously close to the Golden Gate Bridge. The Army punished him. The officer who noticed his behavior was General George Kenney. But Kenney also noticed something else. The young pilot had extraordinary skill. Instead of ending Bong's career, Kenney remembered his name. When Kenney later took command of the 5th Air Force in the Pacific, he brought Bong with him, because the Pacific needed pilots who could do something different. And the new P-38 needed pilots willing to believe that the old rules were dead. When Bong arrived in New Guinea, the war was still uncertain. Japan was pushing toward Port Moresby. The jungle battlefield was brutal. The weather was unforgiving. The distances were enormous. And above it all, Japanese aircraft still controlled the sky. The Lightning was about to be tested. So was the young pilot sitting inside it. On the 27th of December, 1942, Richard Bong climbed into a borrowed P-38. His own squadron was still waiting for its aircraft. He was flying with another unit. He was not supposed to be part of the mission, but he found a way into the fight. And somewhere above the coast of New Guinea, a young American pilot made a decision. He would not fight the Zero's war. He would force the Zero to fight his. The Japanese pilots approaching the coast of New Guinea believed they understood the battle they were entering. For years they had. They knew how American pilots fought. They knew what American fighters could do. They knew that if they forced an enemy into a turning fight, the advantage belonged to them. That confidence had been earned. The Zero had created it, but on that morning, the rules had changed. The Japanese pilots looked for the familiar signs: an enemy trying to maneuver, an opponent slowing down, a fighter coming close enough to challenge them. Instead, they saw something else: aircraft above them. American fighters refusing to come down into their world. The P-38s attacked from a place where the Zero was weakest. The vertical, the Japanese pilots could not climb quickly enough to reach them. They could not dive safely enough to follow them. The very qualities that had made the Zero feared became useless against an enemy that refused to play the same game. The first victories of Richard Bong's career were not simply victories over aircraft. They were proof that an entire way of fighting had been replaced. The Pacific sky was beginning to change, and the men flying below it had not yet realized how much within weeks. Bong's reputation began to grow. But the most important thing about Richard Bong was not that he became an ace. It was how little he seemed interested in becoming one. He did not fit the image many people expected from a famous fighter pilot. He was not loud. He was not arrogant. He did not talk about killing, the aircraft, the mission, the responsibility of bringing his men home. His success came from discipline. He understood what the Lightning demanded. The temptation in combat was always the same. A pilot saw an enemy aircraft damaged and wanted to finish the job. Emotion took over. The chase began. And that was when many pilots died. The Zero was waiting for that mistake. A damaged aircraft could become bait. A desperate pursuit could turn victory into disaster. Bong understood the danger. He attacked quickly. He used the Lightning's advantages. He climbed above the enemy. He chose the moment. He fired. Then he left. It was not glamorous. It was not the kind of flying people imagined when they thought of fighter combat. It was controlled violence, mathematical, precise. The pilots who mastered that discipline survived. The ones who ignored it often disappeared. As more American pilots learned the new tactics, the psychological balance began to shift. Earlier in the war, American pilots looked toward the sky expecting danger. Now Japanese pilots began doing the same. The hunter had become the hunted, and the consequences reached far beyond individual dogfights. Japan's greatest advantage had always been its experienced pilots. The men who flew in 1941 and 1942 were among the best trained aviators in the world. But they were difficult to replace. Every veteran lost was not just one aircraft destroyed. It was years of experience disappearing forever. America faced a different reality. American factories could build aircraft at a scale Japan could not match. Training programs could produce new pilots. The industrial strength behind the P-38 was as important as the machine itself. Japan had created an elite force. America created a system. And over time, systems defeat elites. The turning point became visible in March 1943. A Japanese convoy was moving through the Bismarck Sea, carrying troops and supplies toward New Guinea. The mission was critical. Japan needed reinforcements. Without them, its position in the region would weaken. The Japanese believed naval power could still move forces across the Pacific. But the sky belonged to someone else. Now American aircraft attacked. The P-38s protected the bombers from Japanese fighters trying to intervene. Again, the same pattern repeated. The Zero pilots attempted to engage. The Lightnings refused to fight on their terms. They stayed above. They controlled the engagement. They protected the attack. The convoy was destroyed. Thousands of Japanese soldiers never reached the battlefield. The loss demonstrated something far larger than a single victory. Japan could no longer move freely beneath the sky. Air superiority was not about owning the sky for its own sake. It was about controlling everything beneath it. Ships, troops, supplies, movement itself. And the P-38 had become one of the weapons that made that possible. But perhaps the most extraordinary demonstration of the Lightning's abilities came weeks later. The 18th of April, 1943, a message arrived that created a difficult decision. American intelligence had discovered the travel plans of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the man who had planned the attack on Pearl Harbor, the commander of the Japanese Combined Fleet, one of Japan's most respected military leaders. The opportunity was extraordinary. But so was the risk. The Americans had obtained the information through code breaking. If they attacked Yamamoto, Japan might realize its communications had been compromised. The intelligence advantage could disappear. The decision was not simply, can we kill him? It was, is killing him worth revealing how we found him? The answer came from the highest levels of command. The mission would happen. But there was another problem: distance. Yamamoto's aircraft would be hundreds of miles away from the nearest American base. A normal fighter could not reach him. The mission required an aircraft with unusual range, an aircraft that could travel farther than any fighter before it. The P-38 Lightning, 16 Lightnings prepared for the mission. The plan required extraordinary precision. Major John Mitchell calculated the route. The fighters would fly low over the ocean. No unnecessary communication. No room for mistakes. They had no landmarks. No second chance. For hours, they flew only a few feet above the waves. The pilots watched the endless ocean beneath them. The aircraft shook through turbulence. Fuel disappeared slowly. The question inside every cockpit was the same. Would they arrive at the right place, at the right time? Or would they find nothing? Then, exactly when predicted, the Japanese aircraft appeared. 2 bombers, escorted by 0 fighters. The American pilots moved. Some climbed to engage the escorts. Others went directly for the bombers. The attack was over quickly. The aircraft carrying Yamamoto crashed into the jungle. The man who had planned Pearl Harbor was dead, and the P-38 had done what few believed possible. It had crossed an enormous distance, found a specific target in empty sky, and returned. The mission was not only a military success, it was psychological. Japan had believed distance protected its commanders. Now that belief was gone. The war had reached them. The same aircraft that had changed the dogfight had changed the meaning of distance itself. By 1944, Richard Bong had become America's leading ace. But fame made him uncomfortable. He disliked public attention. He preferred flying. He preferred the cockpit. He preferred the simple clarity of combat. In April 1944, he surpassed Eddie Rickenbacker's World War I record of 26 victories. The achievement made headlines, but Bong remained the same quiet pilot from Wisconsin. He did not describe himself as extraordinary. He often credited his aircraft, his squadron, his training, his luck. By the end of the war, his official victory total reached 40 enemy aircraft, 40 moments when another pilot failed to return, 40 times when Bong climbed into the sky and came back alive. No American pilot has ever surpassed that record. But the story of the P-38 was never only about Richard Bong. It was about thousands of pilots who learned the same lesson. The machine mattered, but the method mattered more. A great aircraft with the wrong tactics could fail. A good pilot with the wrong strategy could die. The victory came from combining both: the lightning, the vertical fight, the discipline, the industrial power behind it all together. They changed the Pacific War. Japan eventually developed new fighters, but by then, the balance had already shifted. The Zero had been built for a world where skill and agility decided victory. The Americans created a world where speed, altitude, and production decided it. The future belonged to the side that could build more, train more, and adapt faster. Richard Bong survived the war, but not for long after returning home. He became a test pilot for Lockheed. The fighter pilot who had spent years mastering the P-38 was now helping develop the next generation of aircraft. The age of propeller fighters was ending. The jet age was beginning. On the 6th of August, 1945, Bong took off in a Lockheed P-80 jet fighter. The engine failed shortly after takeoff. He attempted to escape, but there was not enough altitude. America's greatest fighter ace died at 24 years old. The strange final chapter of his life was that he was killed not by the enemy he had defeated, but by the future he had helped create. The aircraft that replaced the Lightning carried the same idea forward: higher, faster, farther, never fight the enemy where he is strongest. Force him into a battle where he has no answer. The P-38 Lightning did not defeat the Zero because it was simply a better airplane. It defeated the Zero because it changed the question. Japan asked, "How do we build a fighter that can turn better?" America asked, "What if we stop turning?" And that question transformed the Pacific sky forever. Today, the stories of famous pilots remain: the victories, the medals, the numbers. But the most lasting image is quieter. A young man from a small Wisconsin farm town sitting inside a strange-looking aircraft with 2 engines and twin tails. Below him was an enemy that had ruled the sky. Around him was a war that demanded impossible decisions. And above him was empty space. Richard Bong pushed the nose down, not because he understood something the enemy did not. The battle was already decided before the guns fired. The man who controlled the sky controlled the fight.